All right, guys, welcome to another Source Gaming discussion. Today we're going to be talking about the proposed or rumored SNES Classic, much like the NES Classic. This would be built-in hardware, small miniature Super Nintendo. What I wanted to talk about was a little bit different games that, we might want on the system, maybe deserve to be on the system, but we know just won't, for one reason or another, be on the Super Nintendo Classic. I've got Oliver here today from Minus World. Say hello.
Hey.
Pretty good voice as far as retro games go, so I think the two of us will be able to
flattering me from the get-go.
Cover some of these games. The first thing I want to bring up a little bit are some kind of unlikely third-party games. These are games that probably, if Nintendo wanted to put them on there, they could. But we probably won't see. And the first thing I want to talk about are kind of the Lucas Arts games, and those I think are a little bit different, right? Because the thing is, I feel like they almost become licensed games now because LucasArts is owned by Disney.
Yeah, well, the situation's kind of changed with LucasArts quite a bit, and I don't believe any of the games from that era have been re-released recently. Not at least since Disney have kind of taken things over.
Yeah, I'll agree with you on that. There's two that really kind of come to mind, and one is the Nintendo release of Maniac Mansion, which is a point-and-click game, or actually kind of a point-and-typing text game at that point. Went on to spawn the sequel, Day of the Tentacle, which just in case anyone wants to know, might be my favorite point-and-click game of all time.
That just got re-released as well. So.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. And yeah, I own it. I own the remaster of that one as well. And the other one is actually a game that was published by Konami. So this is also an issue where you would have, to grab the game rights from multiple people, and that's Zombie Ate My Neighbors, and that one hurts because I know there's a lot of people that are just a kind of big fan of that game in particular.
Yeah, that would be a great co-op title.
Yeah, it's a fun co-op game. It's very unique. It's got a great sense of humor. It would fit awesome in a collection.
It's very easy to just pick it up and play it, which I think is kind of almost what they need for a collection like this.
Right.
Like a few games like that,
I was never able to get my hand on the NES Classic, but when I did, I definitely got my time on with games like Contra, and I feel like one of the bigger faults in that, and Dr. Mario, was actually not getting Tetris, but that's neither here nor there. So, and I guess that's kind of another strike against LucasArts, is that I don't believe there were any third-party Western developed titles on the NES Classic, so that's just something to kind
of. There were a couple of sports titles, but even them, I think, were developed in Japan. Is that right? Tecmo Bowl, is that a Western title? I can't say I'm an expert when it comes to American football or American football games, so
It was developed by Tecmo Koei.
Oh God, yeah, of course. Yeah, there you go. Right,
Tecmo Bowl. So
well, there you have it. But I think a game like Maniac Mansion. How do you pronounce it? Maniac Mansion. We kind of, they want a mixture of genres on there. Nintendo don't really have any point-and-click games themselves, so a title like that I think would be a good addition to give the console a kind of wide lineup, widespread of genres.
Another group of games I wanted to talk about, and this is kind of in a general sense, are Enix games, because now we kind of know it as Square Enix, but back in the 16-bit, the early 32-bit days, obviously back in the NES days, you kind of had these two JRPG juggernauts, but in the West, kind of Squaresoft took all of the shine, and Enix made just like a wide variety of just like great games for the Super Nintendo. There's a Soul Blazer trilogy of Terranigma, Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia. Personally, I love Evo: The Search for Eden because it is a weird game, and if you've never played that game and you kind of like action adventure RPGs, do yourself a favor and go and play it because it's a game where you start as a fish and you have to evolve to win the hand of Gaia. There's something about aliens. I don't know. You're a dinosaur at some point. It's pretty great.
Yeah, a game from the same developer, which was only released in Japan, is a Wonder Project J, which is like a kind of
Yes.
life simulation. That's quite a kind of cult favorite in Japan. Obviously, the fact it hasn't been localized would kind of throw it
Right,
up
and
in the
that's
air a
kind of
bit.
the other thing about a lot of their games. Like I would say that on the Japanese version of this console, we're definitely going to get some Dragon's Quest games.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's no doubt about it. I mean, it's Dragon Quest. You know, you see the pictures of people queuing up in the street for it. They have to have it on there. But the problem is the Dragon Quest games on the SNES, they didn't reach the West until the 2000s, and basically until it was until they released on the DS. So
Right. So yeah, they weren't even localized. So there's no way that I could see them make it. In fact, the only Enix game off the top of my head that I could see on a North American release is maybe ActRaiser, which I mean is an awesome game, but I mean that's about it. I mean, are there any other like kind of standout, kind of critically acclaimed or important SNES games you can think of? I think those are the ones that kind of stand out to me that I just know as far as being a game that's good but just unlikely in so
unlikely to come together. I mean, in terms of third party stuff, I mean, obviously there are the big obvious titles like Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana, where I kind of
yeah.
I have some doubts about whether or not they'll make it. They're titles that haven't cropped up on the Virtual Console, so and especially with Secret of Mana about to get a re-release on the Switch, it seems unlikely that they'd show up.
Yeah, Squaresoft's a little strange about that because they like to release Chrono Trigger as a full package. So, I mean, I'd at least think Final Fantasy 4 or 6 would be on there.
I think so. Yeah, there'll be a I mean, there was Final Fantasy on the
right
on the NES Mini. Even though those Final Fantasy games probably weren't people's favorites, I think was the original on there, and
it was just the original. I don't remember if the Famicom
was.
Classic
Did the
one.
Famicom have Final Fantasy 3, or was that even on the Famicom or not?
Pull up the list.
It was. Yeah, it was exclusive. It was exclusive to the Famicom Mini, Final Fantasy 3. So there you go. Yeah. I think there'll definitely be a Final Fantasy game on there.
Right, but the thing is, Squaresoft kind of has an embarrassment of riches on the console because there's so many great, well-received games. Super Mario RPG.
Yeah,
is kind of another
one. That's a big one. Especially considering Nintendo are involved in that to some extent. Although that took a while to come out on the Virtual Console. I mean, it hadn't been released in Europe up until the Wii Virtual Console release. So that would be a good one in terms of getting more people to play it. It's quite accessible.
Yeah, and I mean it's kind of the origin point of all of the modern Mario RPGs.
Yeah.
At least the ones that don't involve rabbits. So.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. There'll be no rabbits on this system. That's for sure.
No, this will be a rabbit. That's how they should market it. Zero rabbits. 100% less rabbits in the Wii.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to look at that way because that's another thing that you may have to realize is that when it comes to 16-bit games, Capcom likes to re-release Mega Man X. Squaresoft really likes to release their games from that era in packages, so they may not want to kind of cheapen the value of those games when they think that, hey, I can sell Chrono Trigger again for $15.
Yeah, I mean, especially they've had these iOS releases that have kind of really stood out because, like, amongst 99p games or 99-cents games, you've got something that's costing you a tenner. One big one I think that'll be interesting is Street Fighter 2 because that's like an absolute SNES staple that has to be there. But they've just re-released it on the Switch with this new package, which is kind of essentially has classic Street Fighter 2 in there, obviously the new characters and changes. So it'll be interesting to see if that one makes the cut here, considering they've valued it as a full price retail title in 2017.
Yeah, I mean, interesting fact. I believe Street Fighter 2 is still the highest. The best-selling single platform game that Capcom's released. As far as one game on one
like to fall back on it, definitely.
Yeah. All right. I guess another big category, and this one's going to hurt a lot of people, are licensed games. And I feel like the quality of licensed games isn't the same as it was on the NES.
No, you haven't got that big hitter in terms of the Capcom Disney games. I think that was always like the major one.
Right.
you could probably say there are less licensed games in general. Probably is a change in the times. I guess you've gone from the 80s to the 90s. You know, you haven't got all the pizza tie-ins. There's no Yo-Noid, but you have got Cool Spot. You know, was that on the SNES or was that Genesis?
It was a multi-plat. And you know what? If you look back, there were a lot. It's just that we started entering that time where licensed games were crap. Not all of them. There were some amazing licensed games, but then you also got like, hey, what kids cartoon is on now? You know, what there's this. I don't even remember it. You know, Family Dog, I think was on there. I don't know. There were just all these this wide variety of games where they were based on properties. You know, and then even had, you know, here's a Toy Story game. Here's this. Here's that. And some of them were interesting, but for the most part, they weren't that special. There were some great Capcom and Virgin Disney games. Aladdin is a standout. Aladdin was a very, very good game. Good counterpoint to the Mega Drive Genesis version of that game.
Aladdin and I think Lion King as well seem to get. There seems to be a lot of debate about which version of those is the best. But you know, they'd seem like, in terms of a licensed game, they'd seem like a safe bet. But I think the second Disney become involved, you know, you're talking big money, so it'd be hard for Nintendo to justify them, especially when they've got such a good library of platformers on their own.
Right. And although I'm sure we'll see some beat 'em ups from several companies on there, including Capcom, I will say that maybe the best beat 'em up on that system is not going to be on there, and that's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4: Turtles in Time. That game
that's a classic.
Yeah, that is a fantastic game. Just really good. And that's not that. I mean, due to the licensing of the Turtles, I don't see that getting on there.
Yeah, I mean, the license with that was last with Ubisoft, wasn't it? They did a remake of that at some point in the 2000s. I remember playing that on Xbox 360. So I think it's probably. I mean, I'm not sure who holds the actual license of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In terms of games-wise, I think it's definitely Ubisoft. Konami obviously made the original game.
Yeah, it was Konami, then it was Ubisoft. Now it falls under the Nickelodeon umbrella. It's no longer Ubisoft. Right. I think Ubisoft lost it after that Ninja Turtles smash-up game.
Okay, and I guess there was the Platinum Games one as well, but you know, that's going in a whole different direction. So,
but yeah, exactly. You'd have to deal with, and right now, you know, it's not even Mirage Studios as it was the licensing department for Ninja Turtles. Ninja Turtles was bought a few years back by Nickelodeon, so you would have to deal once again with kind of a giant entity to do that. And I mean, there was a wide variety of beat 'em ups on the system, you know, that were licensed, from Batman Returns to Spider-Man. Was a Maximum Carnage game.
Yeah,
was a decent enough one, and none of those I think would really stand much of a chance of getting in there.
Yeah, it's probably, I mean, in terms of beat 'em ups, it's going to be Final Fight, probably, isn't it? So
yeah, no, for sure. And it's kind of a shame because hopefully it'd be maybe one of the Final Fights 2 or 3. The first one's the real classic of the series, but it also on the Super Nintendo was a launch title, and it had, if not a launch, it was a launch window title. I know
it was definitely an earlier one.
Right.
I don't know. Newer players might not find it so forgiving, I suppose.
It's not just that; it's a one-player game. They got the co-op to work in the sequels, yeah. Or on the Sega CD version, they actually had co-op. But you know, we're not talking about a Sega CD classic.
No.
So
no, that's a different discussion.
Or you know, just a personal favorite was Blizzard developed several Super Nintendo games, and amongst them was the Death of Superman, and that was a fun beat 'em up.
I never played that, but
I actually don't think we'll see any of the Blizzard games, which would include. This would be more of the last section, but just real quick, Blackthorn, which is kind of one of those, almost like a. I mean, it reminds me of a cinematic platformer, but it's not. But it's a cool game. Blackthorn is a cool game. Lost Vikings, which is kind of this kind of puzzle-y platformer, which is really good. But once again, it's a Western studio, and I doubt, you know, and Blizzard's not a company that I guess part of Activision, and Activision works.
I think Nintendo are they're going to do what they did with the NES Mini, and they're going to go to their close Japanese partners, I think, for third party stuff.
Right, exactly. I would put money on that. So that's basically for licensed games, but I guess there's a subsection of the licensed game that I doubt we'll see anything of, and
Yeah.
those are sports games.
Oh
Sports
yeah.
games are always weird. We got Tecmo Bowl, but we didn't get Super Tecmo Bowl on the NES Classic. And the difference between that is Super Tecmo Bowl actually used real athletes and real sports teams. Tecmo Bowl used Team Rygar and Team Ninja Gaiden. It wasn't didn't use actual likenesses, and that's always a problem in re-releases.
Mm. Yeah, there are. As someone in Europe, they did. I was surprised that they didn't put on something like soccer, just to try and kind of um, appeal to that European market. There are a bunch of really solid first party sports games on the NES that didn't crop up, like ice hockey, that kind of almost seem like obvious
Right.
choices.
Pro
On the
wrestling.
SNES, yeah, pro wrestling as well. On the SNES, Nintendo, they don't really have any first party sports games. There are a lot of great licensed football or soccer games on the SNES, but a lot of them were made in Japan. There are games made for the Japanese market, modeled after the Italian Football League. But the problem is you're dealing with players from the 90s. It's basically impossible to negotiate now.
Right. The big one that stands out for me actually is NBA Jam, because that game was huge. It was really, they had Blockbuster had special editions. There were tournaments held for it.
Yeah.
It was just like this fun, super arcadey game. It's very well remembered. So much so that they made that remake on Wii and then on PS3 and Xbox 360 arcade.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I suppose recently was it NBA Playgrounds, which is almost a sort of spiritual successor, came out.
Right.
So there's
Exactly.
still, I think
Like
there's
that.
still, people are still into that kind of after that sort of more arcadey feeling
Right. And
sports
I mean
games.
that was kind of the game that kind of set the tone for those kind of silly um, kind of sports titles. But that I don't see NBA Jam being on there, and that is kind of a shame because that is kind of a quintessential like 16-bit game.
Yeah, if there
So
was going to be one sports game, it would have to be that.
right.
We're probably more likely to get something like. The only thing that really comes to mind as being possible is Mega Man Soccer. But I don't know if anyone's got any particularly fond memories of that or not. So.
I am very appreciative of the fact that that title exists. And that's
Yeah, me too. Yeah, we can agree on that at least. But yeah, that is definitely an odd one.
So I guess next, and these are ones that a lot of people that I guess more kind of casual fans may not really think of, are games that are not going to be on there due to licensing issues. And the first one I think we should talk about are all the Super FX Argonaut games, because that includes kind of two huge games that I think would be on here no matter what if it wasn't for these issues.
Yeah, and these are issues that have stopped them from appearing on the Virtual Console for years. Even though people would really definitely want them on there because they're kind of staple games, they're part of staple franchises as well.
Yeah, and I guess the first one to talk. Let's just talk about all of them at once. Yoshi's Island, which a lot of people don't realize. I didn't actually realize this at first. It's the Super Nintendo version of that game has never been re-released.
Yeah, they've put out. For the Ambassador series on the 3DS, the Ambassador Virtual Console games, and on the Wii U, they've only ever released the GBA version, which I think is Super Mario Advance 3. Is that right? Is it 3 or 4? I'm pretty sure it's 3. They were able to re-release that version, which does have more content in it, but the original is basically kind of held in limbo because the Super FX chip, which provides some of the kind of graphical effects, was developed by Argonaut, who have now kind of gone off in their own direction. Had a bit of a falling out with Nintendo because they developed a pitch for a Yoshi game on the Nintendo 64, which now is known, ended up becoming Croc on the PS1.
Right.
And so from that point on, they haven't. They kind of fell apart after that, essentially, and they haven't been able to re-release anything.
And I guess the other big game there would be Star Fox, which kind of was obviously the origin of that entire franchise.
Yeah.
So and that's a game that would be there and also hasn't been re-released. And also Stunt Race FX, which is something I could see in a collection, but isn't as important of a game. at all.
Yeah, I like it though. It's got a really good. It's got good music. It's got some interesting visual effects as well. These kind of like rain on the windshield and stuff. It's the sort of game which, if they were able to release it, it might be in there. It's a game that probably people have fond memories for, but they don't think about it in the same way as Mario or something.
Right. And here's another one that might not come to mind immediately, but I thought was a pretty important game for the system. And this particular port was pretty unique in that it was developed by Nintendo EAD. The character of Mr. Wright, who was based off of Will Wright, has appeared in other games, Link's Awakening and Smash Brothers.
Yeah, Smash Bros. Yeah, recently.
And it was a really good version of the game. And of course, from what I'm saying, I'm talking about the Super Nintendo version of SimCity, which was also a launch window game.
And that was the first home console version of SimCity, I think. So.
Right, and it's really one of the first kind of standout versions of kind of this city management kind of genre of games being on a home console.
Yeah,
it was, and I don't know a lot of the details of this one. Like I said, it was developed with help by Nintendo. It was licensed.
I think Nintendo developed it entirely themselves. They actually got the SimCity license from Maxis. I'm not really sure how that went down or what the kind of motivation was behind that. But there was a point where it was on the Virtual Console on the Wii, but it was removed, and since then it hasn't shown up again.
And even if they had the licensing, I believe Maxis is a subsidiary right now of EA, and once again they haven't been doing too much as far as releases for Western third parties on the NES Classic. So it's just one of those where I don't know exactly what the licensing issues with it are, but the fact that it was removed and just it's just I don't think it's a game to show up.
Yeah, it's a shame because it technically is I suppose you'd say it's a second party Nintendo game. It was developed by Nintendo and it's got their charm in it, and obviously it's got the SimCity mechanics, which are pretty solid.
It has Bowser in it.
Yeah, it has Bowser and Mario, I think, doesn't it? They kind of have some fight or something. Is that right?
I don't remember if Mario's in it. I remember that they one of the natural disasters that can occur in the original SimCity game is Monster Attack, and they replaced the generic monster with just Bowser.
Of course, yeah. I'll tell you what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of SimCity 64, which was only released on the Nintendo 64 DD. One of the rewards you could get for like topping your population or maxing out your population or whatever was a giant statue of Mario. So
that's
Nintendo
right.
have got some connections with SimCity, but it seems like it's fizzled out. It's a shame.
Okay. The other one is Uniracers. And I'm not this one just seems so weird to me. Uniracers was a very cool game for those people who've never played it. It had a really good sense of speed. The animation was really good, and it was basically a game where you race tiny unicycles in crazy loopy Sonic the Hedgehog environments. So what exactly is the issue here? Maybe you know a little bit more than I do. I know that it was developed with Pixar, actually, correct? Wasn't that?
Well, Pixar are a big reason as to why it can't be re-released. Basically, It was developed by a studio called DMA Design, and it was co-developed by Nintendo of America. Nintendo published it in 1994, and basically, after the game came out, Pixar sued DMA Design because they said that the design of the unicycles in the game was copying a unicycle character from a film they made called Red's Dream, which I've never seen. DMA Design lost the lawsuit, and Nintendo basically were told they couldn't make any more copies of the game. So it sold 300,000 in its initial run, but they weren't allowed to make any more carts. And since then, it's basically I don't think they're allowed to re-release it.
Right. Okay. Got it. Yeah. So that's something that's never going to see the light of day because basically a subsidiary of Disney said, "Hey, we're going to sue you because this is too close to our likeness."
Yeah, so that's another interesting one though because it was developed by a Western developer. DMA Design are actually based in Scotland, or were based in Scotland. I'm not sure if they're around today, but so it's a Nintendo published game, but also the factor of it being Western made could come into play as to whether or not it get picked over. I mean, in terms of racing games, I mean, Super Mario Kart's obviously a given. F-Zero as well, yeah.
So I would bank on those being the primary racing games. I don't know if we'd see anything else. Yeah, but Uniracers has a very different feel. Like I said, it's a from a side-scrolling perspective. It's a different sort of thing. It's almost like more like a stunt game. I feel like it has more in common with something like Tony Hawk than with Mario Kart. Um, and once again, that would add a lot of genre variety. Another thing, and SimCity would as well.
Yeah,
That's
definitely. Those are two that I think would have been great, but
Yeah, well, it is what it is. And then there's some that it comes into kind of localization type of issues. Uh, a Panel de Pon was localized as Tetris Attack, and once you get the Tetris license in, then things become more muddied.
Yeah, well, it's almost a death sentence now because I think the original Game Boy Tetris was pulled from the Virtual Console. I think I actually read an interview once where someone from the Tetris company talked about Tetris Attack, and obviously Panel de Pon is it's very very different to Tetris.
Yeah,
it's got coloured blocks, but beyond that, it's almost totally different. And there was almost a kind of hint of regret. They were kind of like, yeah, to be honest, we sort of regret doing this because we regret giving Nintendo this license because it totally goes against the Tetris kind of brand. But obviously Nintendo, trying to market the game, they completely changed the aesthetic. I think Yoshi was the main character in the Western version. They also, obviously Tetris is a big name, probably easier to sell than one with a bunch of fairies in it. But
what's funny is Panel de Pon, I could definitely see being on the Super Famicom Classic.
Yeah, no, I think it's not impossible. I mean, as far as puzzle games go, there isn't a huge amount of choice. Wario's Woods was released on the SNES. I believe that was in the NES Classic. Is that right? No, it wasn't. I don't know where I've got that one from. But that was a really late NES title anyway. So.
I mean, I could see Kirby's Avalanche on there.
That's a potential one, yeah, definitely.
But what's funny is because of the way it was localized, I could see it being in the Japanese version, but not in the North American or European versions of this console. I thought that was a one to kind of bring up. I mean, then you have unreleased games, which this isn't. I mean, this is a big nostalgia box, so you're not going to see any unreleased games.
Yeah, definitely. The big one that comes to mind is probably Star Fox 2, because we know by this point that it basically is a finished game. But if they won't put it on the Virtual Console, I doubt it'll be in this. And obviously, there's the Argonaut issue there as well. So.
Right, and Star Fox 2. I mean, I could also see that's almost a situation like when they did the Western release of Sin and Punishment, or if Mother 3 actually gets localized, where they can kind of make a big deal about it. So just shoving it on a box like this, which is going to sell out regardless. It's not like it needs, it doesn't need a big selling point. Would almost be a waste.
Yeah.
So I think that wraps up the majority of things. I think I also kind of wanted to talk about some hardware specific games.
Yeah, definitely, because there are a lot on the SNES. There's a lot of strange bits of hardware and kind of paraphernalia and all that that I think would basically cut a few things off.
Right, because there were no light gun games on the NES Classic because they didn't want to have to give you a light gun.
Which is almost a shame, really, because you think about the NES being bundled with the Zapper, it was kind of a big part of it. But then I guess if they had to put the Zapper in, next people would be asking for Rob.
Yeah, where's my track and field?
Where's my family trainer pad or whatever the thing we have to run on? Yeah,
the power pad. Yeah,
that's it.
So I guess talking about the Zapper, kind of the Super Nintendo version of the Zapper was the Super Scope.
Yeah, the massive bazooka.
Right. And there were a couple games for that which I think are kind of standouts. Yoshi's Safari.
Yeah, not one I've ever played, but I mean, it's a Mario game where Mario shoots people with a gun, which obviously they're bringing back now with the Rabbids, but that was the original.
Yeah, and it was a good one. Tim Star is another one, which is actually a pretty cool game, even though a lot of people aren't really aware of it. Battle Clash with the robots. Basically any game that came out for this is not going to make the cut. Yoshi Safari is obviously the big one.
And then and I suppose the Super Scope 6, which was the cartridge that came bundled with it, which is basically just kind of tech demos, really. So almost.
Yeah. It was the Wii Sports of its era.
No. Yeah. Maybe not quite the same.
And then another huge one, because this one is really an important game to a lot of people, is Mario Paint, and really once again any of this SNES mouse games, which I think is basically just Mario Paint. And,
the only other one that comes to mind is Mario and Wario, the puzzle game where Wario sticks a bucket on Mario's head and he can't see, and you have to guide him around with the mouse. But that was never localized. So
Oh man, speaking of Mario games that are weird, we're not gonna get Mario is Missing. Just
that
trying to
is
point
true.
that out.
Mario's Missing and Mario's Time Machine. Yeah,
Yeah,
no. The edutainment. That's what it's lacking in terms of genres. Edutainment games.
yeah, and I doubt we'll
Yeah.
see those. But I guess more to the point. Mario Paint, I think is a really big one. So many people have so many fond memories of that. I mean, to the point that a lot of elements of it made it into Mario Maker, at least aesthetically.
Yeah, definitely. It's very evident throughout.
Right. Kind of a weird area talking about hardware are the Super Game Boy games
Yeah.
because none of those games were truly, you know, games for the Super Nintendo, but there were games that had unique content or unique color palettes, unique borders. Donkey Kong, the Donkey Kong Game Boy game. What was that? Donkey Kong
95?
94?
That is an outstanding game though. It gives you the old bait and switch. You think you've just bought the original Donkey Kong, and then you clear it and you've got all these levels. That's a really overlooked Nintendo game.
Right, and that's actually the genesis of the Mario vs Donkey Kong games, because that's where
that's what
all the mechanics
led into it. Yeah.
That's definitely one of my favorite games, and that game was a game that was kind of sold to show off the Super Game Boy. So that game has unique colors, really cool, like arcadey border for it, all sorts of stuff like that. But I mean that falls into a whole new thing. We're not going to get any Super Game Boy games on here.
Yeah, we're talking about putting another console's games onto this console now, But I suppose it's interesting because the NES didn't really. I mean, beyond the Famicom Disk System, it didn't really have anything strictly like that. It's quite a new idea. Because you were basically getting a Game Boy inside a cartridge. I mean, that's technologically speaking, I think that's what it was. So, interesting one to consider. In terms of first-party hardware, another massive one is the Satellaview. I say massive; it's obviously quite obscure now. It's massive for me anyway. And there's a lot of really solid first-party titles on there that have basically never seen re-release. I mean, there was the BS Zelda games, the remake of the original Legend of Zelda. And one of the original titles, which is kind of a spin on A Link to the Past. There was a number of F-Zero games, Excitebike, Mario Stadium.
Mario Excitebike is a kind of a big one because a lot of people don't realize Excitebike never really took a break. We kind of refer to it as a retro franchise, but it had a Mario themed release, which was pretty cool on the Super Nintendo. It had the NES game, it had an N64 game, it had Wii games. Really, the only generation that Excite didn't exist was this, kind of neither here nor there, but I always think it's interesting. Was in the GameCube era. There's always been Excite games.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I suppose it kind of as that kind of the original extreme sports franchise from Nintendo, it kind of took a back seat once Wave Race and 1080 came along.
Right.
But no, it's interesting. I mean, it's a good remake of Excitebike. Visually, it's a lot more impressive. So it's a shame that one's never seen re-release, because it's not a game that it's obviously never been localized, but it's not a game that really requires much Japanese knowledge.
Yeah, and I think the remake of the original Legend of Zelda is kind of a big one too. But once again, none of these also have been localized either. So even if they were going,
I mean, the Zelda would be a tough one, because one of the big draws of the Satellaview, because it was all broadcast via satellite, was that they had live voiceovers whilst you were playing these games. You played them in installments, so it'd be, for example, an hour on a Tuesday, an hour on a Wednesday, and you'd play along with the game, like with the kind of broadcast schedule, and it would be very difficult. I mean, emulation is now starting to kind of make it possible to experience that now, to the extent that people have even created an English voiceover for the game. But I think it'd be very difficult to. It's not as simple as just dropping a game on there, like it would be with a retail title. It's going to require some work, and I think that would probably put Nintendo off, especially when they can just put A Link to the Past on there.
Right, and I think at the end of the day, that's something to remember, is that this thing is going to sell a lot regardless. So if Nintendo doesn't have to put in that extra work they're not going to localize something new that they can sell later. They're not going to go out of the way to argue with EA and Disney to get certain licenses. That's why we're not going to see a lot of these games. Are there any other? I think those are the big examples of
Yeah,
kind of
those are the
hardware.
most probably the more mainstream ones. There are a couple of a lot more obscure bits of hardware that would make it difficult. The Nintendo Power was basically a not to be confused with the US magazine. It was basically a type of cartridge you could buy. They did one for the Super Famicom and for the Game Boy, and you could take this cartridge to various kind of convenience stores and have games flashed onto it. So it was quite similar to the Famicom disk system, rewritable discs that you could buy. In that, if once you finish with a game, you go there, choose a game from a catalog or from a kiosk, and have that game put on there instead. And there are a couple of games on there that were exclusive to that format. There was 8 Pokemon themed Picross games that were only ever released on that cartridge. And they're an interesting one because in the past, Mario's Super Picross on the Super Famicom has been released on the Virtual Console without any translation, even though it's in Japan. I know at least in Europe it has. So in terms of puzzle games, Picross is kind of one of those games that maybe they could get away with putting on a Western release as well as a Japanese one. But something like this is probably too obscure for them to kind of reach into. And then there are some exclusive point and click games. There's a game called Famicom Bunko Hajimari no Mori, which is like a kind of point and click adventure set in the Japanese countryside, very very traditional. That's actually been re-released on the Virtual Console on the Wii U in Japan, but it's never been localized, and it probably they wouldn't obviously do it for this.
I like how the Super Nintendo was a game that had a few point and click adventure games and a system that had a mouse, but the mouse was never used in it.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's I mean, the mouse was it was a Mario Paint tool, and that was it. I suppose that was the kind of the extent of it. And there are 2 bits of hardware now. We're getting into some really weird stuff here that I have to talk about. Right,
Let's do it.
The first one is called the Laser Birdie, right? And that sounds a lot cooler than it is. It sounds like it's got lasers coming out of it. But what it is basically a giant plastic golf club. This is like a kind of, I suppose it's almost like a predecessor to Wii Sports, except a lot more clunky. And it was packaged with a game with a brilliant name called Get in the Hole, right? It's a golf game. And the whole idea was you could play, it was kind of marketed at businessmen and stuff like that, and it came with this sort of big plastic panel you stood on, and you could use motion control to play golf. I'm not sure if it worked. I don't know if it was any good. I don't know how responsive it was. But obviously, I don't think Nintendo are going to be paying money to produce a giant plastic golf club, or it'll look like one of those Wii knockoffs that your grandma buys for you by mistake in the supermarket.
Yeah, I can see that for sure.
And the other one is, and this is quite similar to the Satellaview, there was something released called the Super Famicom modem, which essentially let you hook your Super Famicom up to a broadband internet connection. Remember them?
Oh, yeah.
Or a dial-up connection. And it was packaged with one game called JRA PAT, which is the Japan Racing Association Personal Access Terminal, right? And what this let you do was you could hook your SNES up to the internet, put your cartridge in, and you could bet on horse races every week from the comfort of your living room.
Right, but I mean, those horse races aren't even going on, man. So how are we?
Well, the weird thing is that it actually it only got discontinued very recently. I think in the last 2 years or so, you were still able to go on there and put bets on if you felt so inclined. I don't know if the market for that is there. I mean, people who bet on horse races, I don't know if going to the SNES is going to be their first course of action. But it's an interesting one anyway that definitely will not appear on a SNES Mini.
You know what? I mean, I guess that's basically because there's so many other games that, like I said, there's going to be more licensed games we could talk about. I could talk about the Jurassic Park game.
Yeah.
There's going to be more third-party games like, hey, it's great, Smash TV.
Yeah, that's a good one.
There's no reason for that not to make it, but I doubt it will.
Yeah, and then there are just a bunch of first-party games that are just probably are lower down the pecking order and aren't
right. There's so
many
Kirby games. There's
so many Kirby spin-offs.
Are all 3 Donkey Kong Country games going to be on there?
Yeah, would all three of them appear? Probably, I don't know. But and then you've also got a few kind of gems, kind of hidden gems. You were talking about Tin Star earlier. Obviously, that's Super Scope. You've got some stuff like Marvelous, which was developed by was created by Eiji Aonuma, who obviously directs a lot of Zelda games now. And these games are just not likely to show up. They're just they're not as popular as the big names. They're not your Marios and your Zeldas and your Metroids.
Right. Hey, what's a great game? Shadowrun. It's not going to be on here. Shadowrun. And here's another one that I didn't really consider until right this second. The Mortal Kombat games were a fairly big deal. Once again, Western games. Number two is they're kind of mature content games.
Well, I mean, there was the big controversy because the SNES versions of Mortal Kombat, they cut out the blood, right? Or they made
only
it
the first
or something.
one.
Only the first one.
Right.
Yeah, because obviously, that basically led to us having ratings boards now for games. So.
Right. I mean, if one came in, it would probably be Mortal Kombat 3 regardless. But which did have the blood. But it's supposed to be kind of a family friendly. And even though when you look back on it, the blood's so cheesy and over the top that it's not a big deal.
Yeah,
I could
still see dated,
that. Yeah, it could still be enough of an issue when they're trying to release like a family friendly all ages sort of thing.
Yeah, well, those games have never they've never shown up on the Virtual Console either. So I think that almost has to be kind of thought about to some extent.
Yeah, you need to look at what was released on the Virtual Console and what was not.
I think fighting games are going to be an interesting one because Street Fighter 2 seems like the obvious, but obviously it just got re-released, like we were talking about earlier, and nothing else really comes to mind. I mean, there's Street Fighter Alpha 2, which isn't a brilliant port, and that's been released on the Virtual Console on the Wii U.
Well, there's the SNK games.
Yeah, there are some arcade ports, but then they're getting re-released on the Switch already, aren't they? With the Arcade Archive series.
Yeah, and you know what? Speaking of this kind of reminded me of a whole other thing we didn't talk about with licensing. Rare games. So that would be the Battletoad games.
Killer Instinct. That's a massive
Killer Instincts. One.
Yep. Maybe I don't know. Clay Fighter. That'll have to be their fighting game.
Right. Which would go well with the fact that I'm sure they're also going to have Earthworm Jim on there. Because if they don't, it's already a failure.
Yeah.
Already a failure.
That's your criteria. Jim or nothing.
Right.
No Jim, no buy.
And once again, the wrestling games because of licensing.
Yeah.
I don't even know if the Fire Pro wrestling games were localized. I couldn't tell you that off the top of my head.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I suppose the big one for wrestling games, there'll be a lot of broken hearts if they ever do an N64 mini because that's where all the killer wrestling games are.
Yeah, and that's also where all the rare games are. I think the N64 they just can't do. There's too many issues, but I don't know. Maybe they'll surprise us.
One last one that's just popped into my head all of a sudden that we haven't talked about is a Fire Emblem, because none of those were localized, but that's a big series in Japan. I think they'll definitely have one of them on a Super Famicom mini. Same as Dragon Quest. Yeah,
and I think this is going to be a case where there's going to be way more differences between the Japanese and American and European ones than there were there were some differences, but I think there's going to be a lot more differences if this actually comes to fruition.
I think what it comes down to is this is a console that they're selling based on nostalgia, so they have to put in games that people are nostalgic for, and when people think back on the Famicom, they're thinking of games like Atlantis Nonazo and Ye Kung Fu that were on the Famicom Mini, but then on the North American NES Mini, you had games like Castlevania 2, which I think, and Punch Out obviously being a big one that was much bigger in the West than in Japan. They have to put on the games that people in each region were playing when they were kids,
Right, exactly. Once again, it's a big nostalgia box, so I think this one would be a very good one for JRPGs.
Well, yeah, it's a good console for it. It'd just be interesting to see if Nintendo are going to wrangle all the good third party ones. I wonder if Earthbound will show up. It seems like it would be a given, but there's been so much trouble getting that re-released in the past that you almost wonder.
Yeah, but I mean, it has had a a worldwide release at this point, even in Europe via Virtual Console. So I would
Yeah, and
imagine.
it was on new 3DS as well. That's true. So you'd hope that that would be possible. I think that would be probably like nowadays. I think that would be a good one to put in there.
Oh, agreed, 100%. Do you have any other points? I think we've covered most of
Yeah, I mean,
what we
I
wanted
think
to.
we've covered a lot. We thought about
Yeah.
quite a lot of stuff. I think there's a lot more to talk about here in terms of stuff that couldn't happen than there was on the NES. So
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, gaming was kind of just bigger at this point, so there's just so much more going
yeah,
on. All right, guys. I guess that's it. I hope you enjoyed our discussion today. So where can people find you, Oliver?
the best place to find me is minusworld.co.uk. That's my website. Lots of kind of games culture writing. Just had an article go up about Smash Bros. Brawl, and I know obviously Source Gaming does a lot of Smash Bros. Stuff, so that might interest you if you're listening to this. Also on Twitter at minusworld. Those two are the best places. So come and have a look.
You can find me at 8-bit Spazzy. Obviously, always at sourcegaming.info. Right here at our YouTube channel, which I'm
and .com now as well.
Yeah, and we are now at .com, so we're moving up in the world. And our YouTube channel, like, subscribe, all the things that everybody on YouTube always tells you to do. Go ahead and do them. So I think that's it. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. Bye, guys. I think that's it. Hope you enjoyed.